All right, folks, let's get started. So I'd like to thank everybody for being a part of this racial equity talks conversation. Folks are still coming in, and so we expect to have a robust conversation tonight. My name is Dr. Henry McKoy, and I will be the host for this evening. Hopefully that you all have had a great day, and so we're going to try to move in through this conversation, and we will have a not only can you utilize the chat function, but we also have a Q&A function that you will be able to put questions and answer in. We ask that you put the Q&A information in as the panels start to go. We will have 2 panels a day, and so let's begin this conversation. So I want to first say again, thank you everybody for being a part of this conversation. This racial equity talk is in partnership and support with Substantial Media LLC, as well as the Computational Democracy Project, which you'll hear a bit more about later, as well as Polis. We're going to encourage you all through the chat again to take part in the Polis poll as we're going through this conversation. So we thank our partners in this endeavor. So let's talk a quick second about what this is about. So this is the kickoff to a series called the National Racial Equity Talks, and this is an overview. So who? Again, I'm Dr. Henry McKoy in partnership with Substantial Media and Polis. And we like to partner with communities around the country, residents and communities in both the US and across the world who have issues they want to talk about. The town hall type conversation focuses really on looking at local racial equity issues in real time that have broader relevance, meaning that it may be happening in one place, but we feel like these conversations are important on a much broader level. How? Well, we like to hear from communities and see the kind of issues that they want to discuss in a transparent format. And then we look to partner. Where? Well, of course, in this COVID time, we will do these virtually, and it makes for a great opportunity to bring many more people into the conversation. So we will, again, connect with the locality, but we also have folks that are watching this conversation nationally and globally. When? This is the first one. We're kicking off this series tonight, and we appreciate you all being a part of it. And depending on the kind of response we get will depend on kind of when our next talk will be. And then why? Particularly racial inequity is something that didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't one or two things, it was a combination of things. And we want to shine a light on those combination of things that continue to drive racial inequity across the United States and across the world. And so we thank you for being a part of this. So why are we doing this, and why does it matter? So to what end? So in one way, it's like holding up a mirror to a community so they can see themselves. A lot of communities say they want to be equitable. They say they want to be inclusive. They say they want to be diverse. So let's hold up a mirror and let them see themselves. Next is, in some ways, it's like flipping that around and holding up a cell phone to a community so that the world can also see what they have going on. We know that in the day of utilizing video and things of that nature, how important that's been to bringing certain things to light. And so we want to hold up, again, a cell phone to the community in some ways to say, hey, you may see one thing, but this is what we see as the rest of the world. We want to offer local voices a chance to have a broader platform to be heard. And so, a lot of folks at the local level feel like they may not have a place that they can talk about the issues, and particularly around racial inequity. So we want to create a platform for that. And this is just not about justice, it's about accountability. And we'll talk more about that later. We also wanted to create a permanent record of a situation through both video archives and case studies for scholars and communities to study and act on. So we'll talk more about that also, but this is being recorded and it will be there in the future for folks to watch. But we also will be doing case studies that dig in deeper into the issues that we cover. Racial equity will only come from addressing issues that are big and small, the macro and the microaggressions, all those things together. And at the end of the day, what we really want to do with this work is to create a permanent change in society by really dismantling systematic racism through education, through transparency, and through action. And again, by bringing everybody together, we feel like that we're speaking to this idea that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so this should be a conversation that we all are interested in having. So why is this conversation important now? I want to offer that things are not always as they seem. So let me offer this quick kind of headline that happened in 2020. Man dies after medical incident during police interaction. 2 officers arrived and located the suspect, a male believed to be in his 40s, in his car. He was ordered to step from his car. After he got out, he physically resisted officers. Officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance. He was transported to Hennepin County Medical Center by ambulance, where he died a short time later. But most of you may recognize that to be the original headlines from the George Floyd incident. We know now that it definitely was not a situation that happened like that, but it was really from a group of very courageous bystanders. We've seen the pictures on the sidewalks, including a 17-year-old with a cell phone. These individuals themselves were not in any immediate danger, but they did record, they agitated, they screamed from the sidelines at the injustice, and they wanted to show it to the world. They wanted to bring truth to power, and we know that they transformed, the George Floyd situation to be this original headline that would not, raise any really alerts in a normal day to be something very different. So what it's important to know is that what we want to do with this series is bring truth to power. We want to shine a light on things that at first glance may not seem huge, but when you look at them closer, they may reveal something else. So I would like to now, do some kickoff talk context, including introducing the different panelists and moderators. And so first, I'd like to introduce the moderator for the first panel, Lisa A. Jones. So Lisa, spent 30 years working in the criminal justice system, really trying to fight against so much stigma that we see in the community, particularly with Black males. She worked her way all the way up to warden. She really focuses at the intersection of social justice and criminal justice. And since retirement, she's taken on this as her mantra to go out and really try to change the world. She serves on the Sheriff Advisory Board here in Durham, North Carolina, and she also is the chair of the Southern Coalition of Social Justice. So we thank Lisa, and she will be moderating the first panel. Next, we have Lashon Anderson-Banks. Lashon is a national and very noted expert in the area of racial justice, particularly in dealing with government. Lashon serves as the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. She's the first one to hold that position. Lashon has worked in her career with hundreds and hundreds of communities across the United States and across the world, particularly local government officials and leaders who want to try to address issues of equity. And so we thank Lashon. Lashon will be moderating the second panel tonight. And so I thank both of you all for being a part of this program. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce the panelists. So first, I would like to introduce attorney Dr. Shawna Lemon. And Shauna, she's had a very stellar career in the legal profession. She's worked her way up through so many different opportunities, and she co-founded Stanek, Lemon, Crouse, and Meeks. And so she will be a part of the first panel, and she will give us insight into really what's going on around some of the legal challenges and jeopardy that we face as Black professionals. And so thank you, Shauna. Next will be Millicent Rogers. So Millicent is the co-president of the People's Alliance of Durham, and Millicent will be a part of the second panel and speak to some issues and challenges that we are having here in Durham. So we thank you for being a part of this, Millicent. Next will be attorney Sheila Huggins. And so Sheila's an attorney here in Durham, North Carolina. Sheila's had a great career. She's been a faculty member at North Carolina Central University's School of Law. She's been a community, totally engaged. She serves as the chair of the Friends of Durham, which is the organization here in Durham, and she'll speak a little bit about that later. And then finally, the fourth panelist, Antonio Jones. So Antonio Jones, MPA, Antonio is the chair of the Durham Committee on Affairs of Black People here in Durham, North Carolina. Antonio has had a great career in public service and working to try to make the community better. And so these make up our four panelists tonight. Again, Shauna will lead off with Lisa on the first panel. Sheila, Antonio, Millicent will be with Lashon on the second panel. So we thank you all for being a part of this, and we bring you back in a little bit. And so let's let's now again set this context for this conversation. Black professional leadership in the DEI world. We know that since the George Floyd incident, we've seen an incredible amount of conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that we, as a group, as a community, as a nation, are really focused on, or we say we're focused on, and we say that we really are caring about it. And so what we want to do today as part of this conversation is, really put that under the light. And so what I want to do right now is move on through this conversation. So why is this important? As I said before, things are not always as they seem. And so what we want to do now is talk about two areas that really are important to this conversation that we're having right now. One has been this kind of rise of the Black professionals since social integration. We've heard this conversation about how since social integration, we're going to have this incredible opportunity for Black professionals to be in leadership positions, and how that ultimately will impact the overall ecosystem. And so we've seen, at least for the last 60 or so years, the rise of Black professionals. And so again, we're going to talk about that today as one of the contexts. And the second thing that we're going to talk about is this idea of allyship, this kind of wonderful allyship between white liberals and Black professionals and the Black community. And so those will serve as a kind of the context for this conversation that we're going to have today. We hope that you will, really again be engaged in what we're going to talk about. And so let me move on for a second. So tonight, we're having a conversation here in Durham, North Carolina, and we're having our town hall. We want to get started. So many of you, all of you suspectly have seen this flyer that we're having this conversation tonight. We're going to have two panels, and we think that both panels will be have a great conversation. So the idea for the run of the show is this: is that we're a couple of minutes behind, just to give people a chance to get in, but we're doing introductions, set some opening context. In a few minutes, we'll kick off this first panel with Lisa and Shauna. That panel will go about 35 minutes, and then I'll come back and do kind of a transitional context from panel 1 to panel 2. Panel 2, again, set to start around 6:50, and that's really the main conversation that we're having here tonight. And then that panel will go roughly to about 7:45, and then I want to get you out of here right at 8 o'clock, but I hope that either way you will stay with us to the end, because I think this will be a very rich conversation. Again, the first panel from 6:10 to about 6:45, again, we're a few minutes behind. We gave about 5 minutes for people to get in at the beginning of the meeting. Will be Lisa and Shauna, and they will have a great conversation about the legal perspective, the perils of anti-discrimination laws for Black professionals. And I think it'll be a very, very rich conversation. And for me, there were some eye-opening things that I didn't know before that I don't think a lot of people knew about anti-discrimination laws. The second panel from roughly 6:50 to 7:45 will be Black public leadership and white liberalism. The main conversation, the case for or against Wendell Davis. Wendell Davis is the Durham County manager here in Durham, North Carolina. And so conversation will be focused around that. And I'll give, again, a bit more context before we go into that conversation. But Lashon will moderate that. We have Sheila and Antonio and Millicent will all be a part of that conversation. And again, feel free to use the chat. Feel free to use the Q&A as we move through this. So setting the stage for panel number 1, the legal perspective, the perils of anti-discrimination laws for Black professionals. Before we do that, I would like to actually invite, we have a distinguished guest with us to just really read a statement to kind of set the tone for the conversation, or at least offer some perspective. Katie Ngangola. Katie was a member of the Durham Racial Equity Task Force. And the Durham Racial Equity Task Force was a task force put together by our local leadership to really look at issues that we have here in the community and try to address those by learning what can we be doing to really address racial inequity in Durham. And so we welcome you, Katie. So thankful for you to take part in this and to lend your voice, and turn it over to you for a moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening. I am Katie Ungongowa. I am the Education Chair for the City of Durham's Race Equity Task Force, and we are honored to be included tonight in this important conversation. And we really appreciate the opportunity to give some context to where we are today in Durham, and continue our efforts to hold Durham's leaders accountable to the report we released last summer. To share some context, we as a task force spent 2 years together crafting this report. We trained in race equity, we spent time building relationships and trust. We committed to community engagement to guide our recommendations. Our internal relationships came first though. We worked hard on those because that is what race equity demands and deserves. And while we also had numerous subcommittees, we also recognized the interconnectedness of them all. We leaned on the expertise of our community, understanding that our own lived experiences are only part of the story. We go into this work as a community. And after almost 2 years of training, researching, engaging, learning, we wrote a love letter to Durham. Our report is a love letter because we love the city, and we want to address, develop, and implement policies and actions to ensure a more equitable Durham community. Overall, our report was warmly received because it seems like most of us collectively agree that Durham strives to be a leader in racial equity. In our report, however, we held up a mirror and we found that we are not quite the leader that we want to be yet. Despite the progressiveness we pride ourselves on as a city, in every area that can be quantified in Durham, there are vast racial disparities. One of the most common themes we encountered in our community engagement was distrust of city and county efforts to deal with issues of racial equity. Because of this, in our report, we clearly articulated the following. When issues of racist treatment are raised in governmental bodies, to the extent possible under the law, we need a standard and open process in which these issues are resolved. They should not be taken care of behind closed doors. Transparency is paramount if we are to make real progress towards racial equity. If we want to have a Durham for all of us, then it is time to seriously address problems of racial inequity. Inequitably negatively affects people of color most profoundly, but it undermines community life for everyone. As numerous studies show, unequal societies are not only unjust, but they are also less safe, healthy, and happy. In our report, we called on white Durhamites in particular to move past discomfort and silence. We need to make visible the opportunity hoarding, the roles and privileges white people hold, and the patterns they create. We believe being truthful about how we got here is critical to show that there is a better way. We cannot be race neutral for a race-based problem. We cannot sit on the sidelines as we witness the acute pain, the dehumanization of our Black and Brown community members, and the systemic anti-Blackness in Durham. Dr. McKoy's own research has told us that progressive cities often have the worst inequities. We have to operationalize who we say we are. And with that, I'd like to share a part of the conclusion of our report and encourage all of you to read it if you haven't had a chance yet. You can just Google Durham Race Equity Task Force and you'll find it there. So here's a little bit of our conclusion to round things out here. Racial equity work in the city of Durham must be permanent, appropriately funded, and institutionally supported by the city, county, and all community stakeholders. The task force is concerned about issues of accountability and long-term sustainability in carrying out this work. Dealing with racial inequity is not the mission of one city council or one mayor. The work is ongoing and long-term. Anti-racism practices and racial equity benefit all residents of Durham. We as a community should be intentional about equity in every aspect of our lived experience to dismantle systemic racism. The Durham Racial Equity Task Force has dedicated itself to the work, putting in countless hours as we tried to both understand the scope and depth of racial inequity in our city and figure out how to overcome it. But this is the work of the whole community and not just elected officials. Our document is intended not to be read-only, but as a spur to action. We call on you as individuals, neighbors, institutions, and communities to become active participants in the struggle to end racism. With the development and sustained implementation of racially equitable policies, we look to become the city we know we can be, where all residents are truly free. And with that, this is urgent and loving work. None of us can afford to sit this out, and we thank you for having us tonight.
Thank you so much, Katie. We appreciate that from the Racial Equity Task Force. And so I saw someone mention in the chat about, wondering how many folks are as part of this town hall right now. We have 184 people who are actively on the thread, and we had about 355 people that signed up. So we continue to expect people to show up, and so this webinar feature I know doesn't give you the same effect sometimes as the Zoom, but trust me, we're getting up to close to 200 folks in the room right now. So you're among many other people. So let's go back and get ready for this first panel. So let me share. So again, Lisa and Shauna will walk us through a really in-depth conversation about some of the legal perspective. To set the stage, I just wanted to read one thing. How well protected are Black professionals against discrimination? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the first major development in anti-discrimination law in the U.S. Though prior civil rights legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1957, addressed some forms of discrimination, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was much broader, providing protections for race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in the areas of voting, education, employment, and public accommodations. The landmark legislation led the way for other federal legislation, which expanded upon the protected classes and forms of discrimination prohibited under federal legislation, such as Fair Housing Act and American with Disabilities Act. These protections have also been expanded through the court's interpretation of these pieces of legislation. For example, the Seventh and Second Circuit courts have both ruled that employment discrimination based on sexual orientation is a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So now I would like to welcome Lisa and Shauna to the stage. It's all yours.
Thank you. We're here, and thank you so much, Henry, and welcome, Shauna. As Henry mentioned, Shauna and I both had high-ranking careers in the country's legal system, and that's really not common for women of color. So tonight we are going to be having more of a conversation than we are an interview, as we spotlight some of the challenges that we've experienced in law enforcement, as well as the perils of anti-discrimination law. Before we start, I'd like to shed some light on a few points of significance to kind of frame our discussion. First is that our country's first law enforcement position was created in 1636 in Boston and was referred to as night watchman. Other colonies created similar positions, and then in the 17th century, the colonies began unifying their entities to develop the first legal system. In 1704 specifically, slave patrols were organized in South Carolina. What we know as sheriffs and police departments today were developed after the Civil War. And not only were they modeled after the slave patrols, but many of the jobs were filled by individuals who had previously held positions as slave catchers. And so a dangerous culture began. African-American people in general and Black women in particular have historically been the lowest member of a subordinated class and race system in America. It was 1872 when the first Black woman became a lawyer. However, due to racism, she ended up working as a New York school teacher. And it wasn't until 1916 when the first Black woman became a police officer. Above all else, these dates show there was no need for consideration of how Black women would fit into such positions of power, let alone become a leader. That fact has not only resulted in unimaginable pain for the Black women who walked this road before us, but continues today and is the reason that conversations like this are absolutely necessary if we're going to end systemic racism. So, Shauna, we're going to start with you. answering a question. Let's talk about, we'll start out talking about our journeys, how we rose up in the justice field. How did your path unfold?
Well, first of all, thank you, Lisa, for that introduction, and thank you, Henry, for this opportunity. Again, I'm Shawna Lemon, and I have a PhD in biomedical science with a specialization in pharmacology and also a law degree. I worked at a boutique patent law firm for nearly 16 years and almost 10 years as a shareholder. I was considered generally, professionally, and financially successful. During my tenure at the firm, I was the only Black attorney out of around 25 to 30 attorneys. So that's over a almost 16-year period. Now, like many Black and brown professionals, I experienced the occasional microaggressions, comments about my cars, clothes, jewelry, etc. You guys know what I'm talking about out there. For example, is that an XYZ car? Well, I didn't go and put some labels on it and badges on it and make it up. Yes, it's a certain car. Now, the follow-up question that wasn't asked, at least verbally and audibly to me, was how could you afford that?
Right.
You know,
Right.
other questions, you know, oh, I heard you went to XYZ Island. I hear it's very nice. Yes, it was. Question, you don't hear about it though. How did you get to go there, right?
That's right. That's
Now,
right.
while all those things are disappointing, it was the kind of thing that many of us have lived with for years and we keep going. But then in 2016, I received the shock of my life when various incidents created a very toxic environment. And in fact, some of those incidents, one in particular stood out where I had one of my colleagues tell another colleague of mine that I play the Black card too much. And this, I never intentionally, never, ever made a formal complaint based on race because I knew how that would end up. I knew it would go nowhere. But with the support of my family and 3 white colleagues, those white colleagues who were willing to stand up against racism, against discrimination and retaliation, we left that toxic environment in 2016. Then in 2019, we started our own intellectual property firm. It's a majority woman-owned firm. And Lisa, our mission is to advocate for diversity and provide a positive work environment for diverse professionals. And that is my journey.
That's fantastic. That makes me feel excited. So, of course, I experienced some things that were relatively similar. I'm sure that you could probably line a group of us up and there are going to be some things that are going to be common across the board. I obtained a master's in criminal justice with a specialization in corrections and behavioral studies. Somehow I always knew that there were causes behind the behaviors that led to incarceration. I started out working in a maximum security state prison in Texas and did a couple of years before I moved on to the federal system. Texas is where I first saw the need for justice reform, because I was struck by something that was called host squads. And host squads consisted of white officers riding on horseback with cowboy hats and shotguns, overseeing inmates who chopped grass and weeds on the side of the road all day. They were shackled together and they were made to sing songs as they chopped the grass. It was 1990 and that was really shocking to me, but even more so it was shocking because it was a female prison at the time. I stayed there for a few years and then my first assignment for the federal system was in Connecticut. And from there I promoted to Oklahoma. After that, I held positions of increasing responsibility in West Virginia, North Carolina, New York, Arizona, and Georgia. I started as a GS-6 correctional officer, and prior to retirement was a GS-14 correctional administrator and serving a term as interim appointment as a senior executive level warden. It wasn't really an anomaly to see a Black female warden by that time. It was my decision to come up the ranks through the field of custody or security, that was unusual. Women often started as officers, and then they would usually branch off into something like human resources or case management or something like that. And I actually considered doing that and did it for a little while, but it just wasn't a good fit for me. And it was actually a white male warden who came to me and said, look, you need to do what you love. Don't listen to all the shoulds, just do what you love. So that's what I did. He and I both, unfortunately, he alone couldn't really change the system that we were both in, but at least having someone on my side helped, you know. And speaking of the legal system, the legal field, as we both already discussed, is predominantly a white male profession. And that often comes with a club mentality. That's what we'll say. Was it the same experience for attorneys? Is it the same way?
Well, several years ago, I had the opportunity to participate in the Director Diversity Initiative sponsored by the UNC School of Law. And one of the speakers described corporate board composition in a somewhat unusual but apropos manner. She described it as male, pale, and stale.
Wow.
But that's what it was basically.
That's new. I never heard that.
Pale, male, pale, and stale.
Wow.
Now, statistically, the American Bar Association has shown that women have outnumbered men in law school in 2020 for the 5th year in a row.
Really?
Yes, and in fact, above 40%. It's been above about 40% since 1986.
Wow.
I'm kind of shocked.
That's new. I had no idea.
Well, the reason being is because women don't outnumber men in leadership positions in the legal field.
So we don't necessarily see them.
Exactly.
Got it.
There's an ABA special initiative to determine the plight of women in the legal profession. And what it showed was that women experience far more harassment and gender bias at work than men. Now add race to that dynamic, and what do you think happens? It's exponential.
Yeah.
What I experienced was that although I may have had a title or a position, I was still at the mercy of male and pale, and in some cases, just pale. Now, with that said, I must say, again, I did leave a toxic environment with 3 white colleagues. Okay, so sometimes, pale, is very helpful. Right? But
Yeah.
3 can't do it alone. Just like your one couldn't do it alone.
You're absolutely right. Wow, I'm really surprised about the numbers for the attorneys. I mean, by the time I came along, it also wasn't unusual to see a female correctional officer, but in 2012, I became the first Black female chief of security of a United States penitentiary. And simultaneously, I became the first Black captain of a correctional complex. And that meant that I was responsible for the security of 2 other correctional facilities other than just the penitentiary. The federal prison had already operated for 40 years under the 3 Prisons Act. And then it had operated for 84 years under the Department of Justice. So basically what I did was when I obtained my position, I crossed a 124-year boundary into where I simply wasn't supposed to be. When I actually mentioned to a mentor that I wanted the job, she just basically smiled at me and said, "Be careful what you ask for." And boy, she was not kidding. Penitentiary security was the boys' club on steroids. It was full of dipping snuff and chewing tobacco, and smoking cigars and telling off-color jokes.
You didn't want to do any of that?
Huh?
You didn't
What
want to
was-
do any of that? No, no.
Look, I declined to answer that question. But you know what? It was, they ran the tactical teams and they mapped out the strategies for keeping the prison and the public safe. And they had the power to shut down the facility without authority. And even though facility captains anyway were like the man, it was penitentiary captains. They were the elite. Once you made it, you were considered golden. And basically the rules just didn't apply to you. The majority of the time that I was there, I experienced a lot of microaggressions like you were talking about. Things like, wow, whoever came up with that idea really led you to do the right thing, as though I couldn't have possibly come up with it on my own. And or passive aggressive things like telling everyone else that we were going to be taking pictures and that the dress code for that day were black suits with white ties, with white shirts. And then I would end up that day with a brown suit with a blue shirt on, and then was made to feel ridiculous because here I am, and I'm already standing out because I look different, but then I'm dressed differently. And it makes it look like that I'm not trying to be a part of the team. You know, those are the challenges that you can't really put a name to. And it sounds ridiculous to say I'm being discriminated against because someone didn't tell me about the dress code. So, and that's exactly what they count on. It's hard to learn the club rules on the fly. And especially when it seems that there are others who receive a laminated copy when they show up, you know. Other times it was just kind of in your face racism and sexism and the other isms done with a kind of an air of what are you going to do about it. But the isms taught me that although the position came with privileges, rules were firmly in place. Often they just weren't enforced until I was the one that was sitting in the chair. Benefits that had never been a problem before were suddenly being abused if they were related to me. And I think that's one of the things that kind of bothered me the most. I'd be told, Lisa, it isn't wrong per se, it just doesn't give the right optics, you know? And, you know, what they were really saying was it doesn't give the right optics for people to see you doing them. You know, like, for example, my captain's car was a Charger and not a 5-year-old Ford. Suddenly there were questions and unsolicited statements about fiscal responsibility or the spending of the taxpayers' dollars, you know. But what the complaints and the comments didn't include was that there was a set budget and a time for vehicles to be changed out. And none of those things had anything to do with me. And also, even better yet, my vehicle was an exact reflection of the vehicle driven by others of my rank and position. Because outsiders didn't know that, they were easily manipulated by folks that just didn't want me to be there. And if I complained, I was just told that we're not talking about them, we're talking about me. And, you know, that I needed to be prepared to take baby steps in order to be seen as equal. Ultimately, if I just wouldn't let it go and dared to complain, they would threaten to take the privilege away from my colleagues and then would be encouraged to blame me for their loss. So that's how I learned that you can be admitted into the club and still be denied membership.
That's true.
You know, so being there isn't necessarily everything that appears to be before we get there. You know, A female executive asked me once, what made me choose a male-dominated field, a male-dominated route through the ranks, knowing how much of a struggle it was going to be. And I'm going to tell you what I told her, but first, I'm going to present that question to you because it really made me think when she asked me.
Well, Lisa, I always wanted to be a lawyer. I was student council president in elementary school, all the way back, also in high school. And I was generally putting my 2 cents in everywhere in a good way. However, I grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, with the Confederate flag flying high on the state Capitol building. Many of you know a lot about that and remember when it came down, but it was up there while I grew up. My parents encouraged me to pursue a career in a field other than law. Now, you might be thinking, well, why wouldn't your parents want you to be a lawyer? I mean, that's a good career, it's prestigious, etc. Well, my parents also grew up in South Carolina, in Columbia. They lived through the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, and they didn't see anybody who looked like their little girl working at any of those big law firms or any of the successful boutique, because it was definitely the good old boys club, and they wanted better for me. So I earned my PhD, but I kept thinking about law school and watching every legal show and that would come out and think, man, I wish I'd gone to law school. Then one day I decided, no regrets. I'm going to do this because there will be more people who look like me in these law firms because I will be one of them. And I will encourage others to go.
Good for you.
And I continue to move forward even on days where it was really hard. You know about that struggle. And there were many where it was difficult. But I did that because my parents and my grandparents encouraged me. They supported me and they sacrificed for me so I could be in the position that I am today. Just as our collective ancestors sacrificed and endured indignities, physical injuries, and even death so that future generations could succeed. So I don't intend to let anybody diminish my accomplishments or treat me disrespectfully without having something to say about it. Now, Lisa, I want to
You know what?
tell that lady.
Look, but the thing is, Shauna, is that I'm going to tell you, I actually retired a couple of years ago, and I'm sitting here listening to you talk, and you about to make me want to go back to work. I'm feeling motivated. That's good stuff.
That's what we need to do. We got to get out there.
So, not only did I work in a predominantly male field, but for the majority of my career, I worked in all male institutions. But it wasn't like I just woke up one day and said, you know what, let me go out here and get a job where I'm working with all these men, nothing against men. I just don't believe anyone wants their life harder, especially when they're a person of color. It's already pretty difficult. And while I did expect a certain amount of difficulty, some things simply caught me by surprise. I knew that in order to make it, I was going to have to take a lot of hardship assignments and go places where other people, especially people of color, didn't want to go. And that meant spending years driving on the back roads in these small, isolated towns, especially in Oklahoma and West Virginia and Georgia, for example. I was on those dark roads late at night because I had to drive a lot of times more than an hour one way so that I could live in a diverse area and feel safe away from work. As an outlier, I always knew I had to overperform. I knew I had to be more prepared, better dressed, and intimately familiar with policies and procedures just to show that I belonged in the room. And anyone that says that that's our imagination has not walked in our shoes, because it's reality. but operating under a different set of standards without showing the physical and mental impact of it that it was having on me, that part was more difficult than I imagined. Twice I was hospitalized and had to go out of my way to ensure that most people didn't know it, because then I felt like I would be admitting that they'd won. And amid that stress, I still had to be approachable, open-minded in narrow-minded spaces, you know, have a quick wit and a sense of humor. And despite my willingness to do more than was often required of my peers, I often found myself at odds with others around me, whether they were my supervisor, my colleagues, or subordinate staff. Instead of others being held responsible, I was generally billed as not being a team player, you know, which was, you know, a code word. Why I did it, say it again, Shauna.
Code word, huh?
Well, there's some, you know, kind of like the optics. And, you know, like most law enforcement, though, regardless of race and gender, I went into the job to make a positive impact, to show that it was possible to do the work without being abusive, and that by learning how the system worked, there were ways to make it better. I started out as a 25-year-old who had grown up in poverty and witnessed how Black people were often treated by law enforcement. And so in my idealistic way, I thought, I'm going to change the system. I'm not going to let the system change me, you know. Now at 55, I know exactly how naive that sounds, but I meant it wholeheartedly. And I tried to live up to my self-imposed challenge. Before corrections, I was a soldier. And I felt like if I could be a soldier, I could do anything. That not only had I gained that right just simply by being a human being, but also because I had served my country, you know. And as a veteran, the job appealed to my personal need for discipline and order, though not always my sense of fairness. I wasn't afraid of the offenders because I knew that to be human was to want respect, and that it didn't cost me anything to give it to them.
Absolutely.
You know, I never forgot that there, but for the grace of God goes I. And so I treated people the way that I wanted to be treated. And so for me, that was firm but fair. And usually when we enter these spaces, Shauna, we're not looking for an easy road, you know, as much as we're looking for purpose and fulfillment. I was raised to believe that life was a struggle. So I met each day with the attitude that work is supposed to be hard. That's why they call it work, you know. And but the world becomes more lonely and frightening when you climb the ranks and then you look around and you don't see other people that look like you. It really kind of lets you, it makes you feel like an island, you know. And I can hear the people that are out there in the audience right now. And I know that probably the main question is, you know, why didn't you report it? What about EEO? Can you talk to me about, you know, legal protections as an attorney that should be available, you know, to all employees and others in business relationships, to include loopholes that are that you're trying to correct, yeah, that protect the underrepresented. Yeah.
Well, you know, as many of us are aware, and in fact, as Henry described earlier, after the Civil War, there were concerted efforts taken to disenfranchise African Americans, Jim Crow laws, empowerment of white supremacist groups, etc. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came along and provided the most relief to date and led to the establishment of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, of the EEOC. That's responsible for enforcing federal laws that make it illegal to discriminate in various settings. Now, I'm not a civil rights attorney, okay? Or at least not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. So bear with me on this. Now, Title VII is a provision of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which, as Henry mentioned, prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and more recently, sexual orientation and gender identity.
Okay.
Classes of individuals are considered protected under Title VII because of the known history of unequal treatment, which has been identified for each of these classes.
The known history.
Exactly. We know that this is what has transpired.
Got it.
So presumably, if you are experiencing employment discrimination or retaliation, and you are a member of the protected class, you can file a complaint at the EEOC.
Except, I feel like there's a but. I feel like there's a but in there.
Well, understand that you may not find the assistance or remedy you believe you should have at the EEOC or under Title VII. So, for example, my case in particular, in 2016, I was a shareholder with an employment agreement.
Right.
I received a W-2, which is what employees receive to account for their wages.
Okay.
I was called an employee, treated like an employee. Other shareholders referred to each other and themselves as employees until it was no longer advantageous to do so. And then it was time to flip the script because something was done and let's conveniently not say this person's an employee. Okay? So far, instead of allowing me to discover additional evidence and present the same to the court, 2 federal courts thus far have decided that I am not an employee and have not provided me an opportunity to gather additional evidence to the contrary.
How did they just decide that? How did they just decide you're not an employee?
Well, unfortunately, they have the power to do that. And they did so at a very early stage. And so that's why there are 2 very problematic issues here.
Okay.
The first is the lack of opportunity to discover and present evidence of discrimination. And that, again, that's for everyone in the protected class. And that's what you're finding with the judiciary currently, the lack of opportunity to find that information and present that evidence of discrimination. Now, the other problematic issue for my case, now I still contend that I was an employee and have documentation to support that, okay, as well as being a shareholder. But for argument's sake, let's say I wasn't an employee, but instead I was a minority owner, owning no more than anyone else.
Okay.
Now, the law that was enacted in 1964 does not cover situations that are happening in 2021. Back then, Black and brown people were just trying to get in the door and try to get a job back then.
That's right.
Okay? And frankly, it may have been a very menial job, but a job is a job, okay? So I don't mean to denigrate anybody's position, but I'm just saying back then, we were just trying to get in the door. But today, we are in the door and we are rising up the professional ranks. But Title VII says, you made it, good luck, you're on your own. No protection from discrimination for you. Understand, there is lawful discrimination, and Black and brown professionals, women, members of the LGBTQ community, and others in the so-called protected class are not protected.
Really?
That's right. And Lisa, I don't know about you, but I don't think it's enough to work hard to earn a seat at the table and then be treated with hostility, disrespect, retaliation, and discrimination and not have any legal recourse because you made it to the table.
Right, right.
Like you said, okay, I'm in the club, but I don't have the membership.
That's right.
Okay, you let me in, but I don't have the rules. I didn't get the dress code.
Right.
So that's a problem.
Well, it's almost like they expect us to just be happy that we're satisfied. Be satisfied you're at the table.
Exactly. Be satisfied that you're at the table. You may
That's
not get any food, but you're at the table. Okay. We might run out and you might not get dessert or anything else.
But you're at the
Sit there,
table.
Be quiet. Okay.
That's right.
Now, some of you may be thinking, well, what about Section 1981? You know, I've heard about that. That prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and ethnicity, and does not require an individual to be an employee. That's great, right?
Sounds good to me.
It on its surface, yes, but no. There's an undue burden placed on the plaintiff at an extremely early stage of litigation. Now, today, you're not as likely to find a noose hanging in your office. Now, unfortunately, some places that does happen, but that's not really likely.
Right.
Instead, what you're going to find is subtle but very powerful discrimination and racism that's at play in 2021.
That's like being killed, death by paper cut.
Absolutely. And the current federal anti-discrimination laws provide empty promises of protection for professionals in the protected class. And these organizations should not be allowed to escape liability for discrimination and retaliation because they provided token titles, but no real authority or control, or they've now become sophisticated and stealth in perpetrating their discrimination.
Well, as I said before, they never anticipated having to deal with us on that level.
Exactly.
As long as they were our superiors instead of our peers, you know, we could be controlled.
Absolutely.
So I'm really surprised because the loopholes and everything really surprised me. So what can be done? How do we fix it? What needs to change in order for the EEO to be effective for, you know, minorities or anyone else that's a protective class? What's not being, we know now what's not being done. What has to happen? What can we do?
What we can do is we can advocate, and we can take a two-pronged approach to that. So first of all, you know, I'm not the only one who's experienced something like this. You're not the only one who's experienced something like this. Plenty of us on this participating this evening have experienced this, but we haven't reported it.
We're the ones with the platform. That's the only reason we get to talk. That's right.
I mean, you may have told some family, members or close friends, but that's it. And that's where it stops. And what happens? You have to leave that situation and you have to mentally, physically, financially fix yourself and move on for the next situation. Now, what we need to do is, again, we need to advocate. And that two-pronged approach is with the judiciary. So those who interpret the laws, they need to understand we're not looking at a law and a situation from the 1960s. We're looking at now. We're, like you said, we've got people at the table. How are they being treated at the table? It's not enough to just sit at the table. And in fact, there was one judge who said, well, they made her a partner. Why would they discriminate against her? To me, if you're asking that question, we've got a problem right there. You don't understand, you don't get it. So we need to work on who we have interpreting these laws. The other thing is
that through voting, Shauna? Is that the way we do that? By but then again, those people, are they appointed?
Now some are appointed and some are elected.
Okay.
So, again, it does come down to voting because you vote for those who appoint, right? So you vote to put someone directly in or remove them, or you vote and see who they will appoint. So voting is very critical. And so again, that's part of advocacy. The second prong is, again, advocacy through the legislature and Congress. So I don't know how many of you out there are familiar with Lilly Ledbetter. So Title VII failed her in terms of pay equity. So Title VII again, and the judiciary, the courts, they failed her. The U.S. Supreme Court, they failed her. But Congress came to the rescue. And in 2009, they passed the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009. Okay. So that was through advocacy. That was through getting out and, talking with your legislators and say, listen, this is what's happening and we need this change.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Thank you. That's great. Uh-oh, I see Henry. Henry, are you cutting us off?
So we have to move on. Use any closing words that you all like to cover? And I know there's some questions that have been in the Q&A, so hopefully you all can maybe answer them separately through the Q&A function. But yes, any closing words?
Yeah, basically the last thing that we wanted to talk about is some misconceptions that we just wanted to leave with. There are two misconceptions that Shauna and I actually discussed previously that we felt like we wanted to leave this discussion with bringing to attention today. The first is that affirmative action was a free pass, and that we should appreciate a seat at the table enough to just be quiet. We actually talked about that a little bit ago, and I and many others were able to use veterans preference to enter the workforce, yet I've never seen it thrown at someone in a negative way. And even when affirmative action assists people of color in getting a foot in the door, it doesn't keep them there. It was obvious that I was the only Black woman in my class when I entered the agency, because I was in the room with 10 other people and they were all white males. But what was not obvious was that I had the highest application score in the room. That part wasn't. And I never wanted to be, none of us have, as you just mentioned, Shauna, the only minority at the table. I just knew that I needed someone to be there that looked like me, especially when the system impacts so many people who look like us. And I didn't feel like I could complain about no one looking like us being there if I wasn't willing to be the one. And then lastly is the angry Black woman moniker. I think we both discussed how much that bothers us. If one of my male counterparts got angry, it was because he wanted the job done right. He was a hard charger, or that's just the way he was. And the troops would run around and scatter when he would come through because they didn't want him to be upset and cuss and yell. But if I was upset, it would often just be, blown off as an angry Black woman, and therefore not to be taken seriously. By misnaming my dissatisfaction, or it was changed into a stereotype. And therefore we're robbed of our right to display human emotion. I truly, my last words are that I'm not an angry Black woman. I'm a leader who viewed their performance or behavior as unacceptable and had every right to expect the problem to be appropriately addressed. So, any final words, Shauna, before we give this back to Henry?
I think you summed it up very well. And let's all be the one so there can be more.
Absolutely. Here, here. So Henry, I understand that we have lots of questions, but what we can just answer them offline and allow the next panel to begin. Is that what you would like for us to do?
Yes, they may be. Well, I know I can answer them actually in the Q&A. I don't know if y'all have that ability to go in, but I know that Greg has been putting some of them in the chat in the panelists. So maybe work with him and you all can ask those questions. There were some great questions about these things and some great responses. So I thank both of you, Lisa and Shauna, for sharing your experiences and laying the foundation for what's it like to be a Black professional as you rise and the challenges that you faced. And so thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us, Henry. Shauna.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. All right. So let's as we move on to the kind of main conversation. Thank you both for that again, and I want to pull up. So thank you all for continuing to be a part of us. I think that was a great conversation. There's a couple things I just want to kind of kind of wrap up that with as we transition to the next one is that, I think if you've been a Black professional and risen up the rank or to that effect, you've seen some of these patterns that Lisa and Shauna just talked about. There's, a lot of times retaliation for speaking out and up, and, the sense of you're forgetting your place. And that's a common theme. Retaliation for disagreeing, where you disagree with the wrong person and all of a sudden you become the enemy, this idea of a good Black versus a bad Black. A lot of times your professional and personal character may get put on kind of public display, and that becomes a situation you get put on trial. We've seen that before, and if there's no negative professional issues for you, then all of a sudden somebody may make them up. They just kind of come up with things that they start trying to use against you. So we've seen that before as well. That may lead to punishment, that may lead to termination, disparity of treatment, some discrimination by technicality, as Shauna mentioned. There are particular rules and regulations that are loopholes that will make it a challenge for you to move forth and take action against discrimination. So anyway, really appreciate that context and that conversation. And thank you. And hopefully you all got something from that as well.